Welcome to the Museum Roadshow. I'm Roger Engstrom. Today we're going to be talking about the Benson Cafe, which is still standing. It was owned and operated by Arnold Beans Benson, and Beans also played baseball for Detroit Lakes.
My father actually had two restaurants in Detroit Lakes. The first restaurant he had was over on the west end of the Blandings building, next to Fritz Dizzy's Deep Rock Station. And he later sold that to Frenzel, Shorty Frenzel's. It became Shorty Frenzel's Cafe after that. And then he, in 1948, I think it was, he built the restaurant by the railroad tracks, Benson's Streamliner Cafe.
When you walk into the restaurant, you walked right into the main area. There was booths all along the right-hand side, and there was a horseshoe counter, had stools all the way around it. There was a pastry thing in the middle, and it had also your ice cream and your different things there where you put your creamers and all that stuff was there. And then there was the kitchen right behind that, and it had an open square for where Dad stood behind the counter, and the kitchen was there with the grill and stove and everything there. And if you walked straight back, then you would get into the kitchen where there was the dishwasher and all that. And then if you went downstairs were the restrooms, and we used to live down in the basement at one time, so that was all set up for living area. There was two restrooms, and then he had an area where he had a meat locker, and that's where all the eggs and meat and everything was kept there, and milk cans and things like that, and those milk cans were very heavy. He had a very good restaurant. It was always clean. All of us kids had to work there. It was hard work, waiting tables and doing dishes and the things we had to do. But he always made everything himself. He'd get down there 4 o'clock in the morning, and he'd close at 8 o'clock at night.
When he'd come in the morning, he would start making the Bismarcks and the rolls. I thought the dinner rolls were the best part. They were always about this tall and fluffy and nice. There'd be this large pan. I don't know how big it was, but there were at least maybe 2 dozen all stuck together on there. And he would make them all himself and put them down there and bake them. And they would be made after the morning stuff, like the Bismarcks and things like that, because people would come in for breakfast and want those things. And he'd make those, and he'd make his own pies, his pie crust. When you got a dinner, you would get soup, you'd get a dinner roll, you'd get a vegetable, you'd get potatoes and gravy, you would get the main thing you ordered, like beef, pork, or ham, or meatballs. Those were always the staples on there. And then you get a dessert that he would make. Sometimes it was bread pudding, sometimes it was rhubarb sauce, and then you'd put cream on top of that. And so he always had a dessert with it, all homemade. His pies, his rolls, caramel rolls, cinnamon rolls, Lon Johns, Bismarcks, his brownies. And he wouldn't always make Fatiman because it was a real pain to make it, and it took a lot of space. And when he would make it and people knew he had it there, then they would come and they'd buy like a dozen or so. Well, then he wouldn't have any left for the customers. And then he'd get kind of upset about that because he wanted some for the customers, and all these people were buying them. It was such a pain in the butt to make. So he made that, and he made his own donuts, and they were in this jar. And it was that, I think, the one that Lily always remembered, the donuts in that one jar he'd make. He would roast his roast together so that he had drippings from all the roast, and then he'd make the gravy, and it was just the best gravy. You could just take a ladle and drink it. It was just always so good. And then there'd be a vegetable of the day, corn or beans or peas, and those were all canned, of course. He would make his own meatballs, and if there was meat left over from the roasts, he would grind that up in with the hamburger and then make his meatballs, and they just tasted so good. And I think it was because they had all that other meat in them. He'd cut it off the bone. Sometimes he'd have Swiss steak for the special of the day, and that was good. And he was never able to duplicate it after he got out of the restaurant. We were going to make it at home one time, and he could not remember how to do it. But at the restaurant, he just did it. He had recipes he could refer to, but he very seldom did, unless it was something he didn't make very often. When I was looking through his recipes, I found the ones for his buns. And I looked through there, and there wasn't a mention of flour. So I said, how much flour do you put in? And he said, till it feels right. So I just took the soup bowl from the restaurant and just put it in until it felt right. And that's how he did a lot of it, by experience over the years. He knew how it looked, he knew how it should feel, and it always seemed to turn out really well. I just remember his soups. They were always so good. My favorite was the potato soup. He usually had the soup on a certain day, and whenever he had the bean soup, you could always count on there being no leftovers, because people knew what day it was. They'd come in and order bean soup. And he had split pea soup. I liked his chicken noodle. His vegetables, he ground up. The vegetables were really small. He ground up in there, and that was always very good too. There was the potato peeler that was right next to the place. And we'd always want him to use a potato peeler because we hated peeling those potatoes that night by hand. And once in a while we could convince him to do it. But it would be a lot to clean it out. And if he didn't clean it out right away, that was a smell that you would not forget. There's those old potatoes in there. But it would just toss the potatoes around inside and just toss the skins off. It would be really interesting. But it would be real smelly. And then there'd be water that squirted in from the top. You'd turn on the little knob, and then the water would spray in the top. So you had to cover the potato peeler with a towel so that the water didn't spray out all over everything. And I was always sitting next to the steam table, so you had to wedge yourself between that and the steam table to get the soup for the day.
Thanks for joining us on the Museum Roadshow. We'll be back next week with more on the Benson Cafe.